On the rooftop of a towering building in the heart of Accra, the city's elite gathered to celebrate the success of a new business venture. Frank stood at the center of it all. At 30, he had already built a tech empire that spanned across the country and even up to Nigeria and South Africa. His sleek black Range Rover 2024 was always seen parked outside exclusive clubs. Every weekend he found himself in lavish penthouses or beachfront resorts, surrounded by the city's most beautiful women and business moguls. His best friend Michael was no different. They were partners in crime, their lives a series of late nights filled with champagne and women. But they were also shrewd businessmen. Together, they ruled the city's nightlife, and nothing seemed out of reach. As he took another sip, his best friend Michael walked up to him, a knowing grin on his face. Michael was one of the few people who understood Frank's restless nature. "I see you're lost in thought," Michael said, raising an eyebrow as he leaned against the bar beside Frank. Frank smiled faintly. "Just thinking about what's next. Another deal, another party. It's all starting to feel like the same thing." Michael chuckled, then looked at him with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Tell you what, I bet you can't win the heart of a woman who doesn't belong to this world or isn't after your money." Frank turned to him, intrigued. "What's in it for me?" he asked, the corners of his lips curling into a sly grin. Michael leaned in closer. 5% of the Halo contract, he said, his eyes glinting with a challenge. "But here's the catch. You have to make her fall in love with you and keep her interested for 6 months." Frank's grin widened. The thrill was back. The stakes were high. 5% of that contract was worth at least $100,000. He studied his friend for a moment before shaking his head with a chuckle. "You know, you never know when to quit, do you?" Michael laughed. "It's just a bit of fun, Frank. Are you in?" "You're on," he said, his voice firm. "Who's the woman?" Michael's eyes sparkled. "I know someone. Her name's Doris. She's a nurse, works in the community, real independent woman. I think you'll find her interesting." Frank raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Independent, huh?" This was going to be interesting. If there was one thing Frank loved more than winning, it was proving people wrong. The next day, Frank stood in front of a modest cafe in Dambai, the type of place he rarely visited. It wasn't the lavish restaurants or expensive lounges that he was accustomed to. The cafe had an intimate vibe, with warm colors and soft jazz music playing in the background. Frank was out of his element, but he didn't mind. As he walked through the door, his eyes immediately scanned the room, looking for Doris. He spotted her, sitting by herself, a book open in front of her. She was dressed simply, in a well-fitted dress and glasses that gave her an air of intellectual elegance. She didn't look up as he approached, so he took a moment to observe her. She wasn't like the women he usually pursued. Finally, when he reached her table, Frank cleared his throat. "Hi, are you Doris?" She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a slight surprise. "And you must be Frank," she replied, her voice confident, yet not overly welcoming. She closed her book, placed it on the table, and waited for him to sit. Frank smiled, pulling out a chair. "I've heard a lot about you. Michael speaks highly of you." Doris raised an eyebrow. "Oh, does he now?" she said, her tone amused but skeptical. She wasn't giving him any signals, and Frank loved it. It was a change from the usual women who were eager to hear his compliments and hang on his every word. There was no game here, no pretenses, just a real conversation waiting to unfold. "So, do you come here often?" Frank asked. Doris leaned back in her chair, folding her arms casually. "I came to grab coffee. I work close by. This is my refuge from the chaos." She looked him up and down, as if assessing whether he could appreciate such simplicity. Frank chuckled. "I'm curious. Why would you spend so much time on things that don't bring in so much money? A nurse, working so hard, yet you may never make millions." Doris's eyes flashed with something. Was it disdain or just disbelief? He wasn't sure, but it only made him more interested. "You'd be surprised what people value, Frank," she said simply, tapping her fingers on the edge of her cup. "Not everything in life is about making money. Some things, like a patient smile, can't be measured." Frank paused. He wasn't used to conversations like this. Doris wasn't interested in money or status. and she clearly wasn't impressed by his charm. She didn't seem to care at all. And yet, the more he spoke to her, the more he wanted to learn about her. Maybe this wouldn't be as easy as he thought, but that only made the challenge more interesting. In the weeks that followed, Frank tried different attempts to win Doris's interest. He had taken her to a few fancy dinners, sent her lavish gifts, but he had not gotten the desired response from her. Doris was kind but distant, always polite but never impressed. Frank's usual tactics didn't seem to work. Then, one afternoon, Doris invited Frank to visit the small community where she volunteered as a nurse in the outskirts of the city. Frank wasn't accustomed to going into the ghetto areas, but he agreed, drawn by a mix of curiosity and admiration for Doris's unwavering dedication to the community. As they drove into the heart of the village, Frank could see the contrast between this place and the environment he was used to. The houses were simple, but there was something comforting about their charm. The clinic where Doris worked was a small building with modest equipment, but it was clean and well-maintained. Doris greeted everyone warmly, patients, children, and fellow health workers alike. "It's not just about treating illness," Doris explained as they walked through the clinic. "It's about building a healthier, stronger community. Every little effort counts here." Frank was moved by her commitment. He had never met anyone so genuinely dedicated to a cause. Everyone did it for the money. For the first time, he felt captivated by her heart. But doesn't this kind of work take a toll? The resources are limited, and the impact is slow. Why put so much effort into something that won't bring in wealth or recognition? Frank asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Doris smiled, her eyes softening as she replied, "It's not about wealth or recognition, Frank. It's about creating a place where people can be healthy, even when they cannot afford it." Frank felt a strange sense of admiration for her. He had come here thinking it would present an opportunity to impress her. But now he realized he was the one who was impressed. He was beginning to see Doris in a new light. On the ride back, they shared a kiss, and he was expecting to be invited inside, but Doris did not offer. The following week, Frank found himself visiting Doris at work. She'd invited him to see the hospital where she worked as a nurse, and although Frank had agreed, he didn't expect much. He had imagined it would be just another small clinic, maybe with a few patients and a couple of nurses. When he arrived, he was surprised. The hospital was modest. The walls were filled with bright paintings of healthy children and smiling families, and the corridors were clean, though the equipment was aging. Doris greeted him at the entrance, her scrubs still on from her shift. "Welcome to my world," she said with a smile, though there was weariness in her eyes. She led him down the hall, passing by the nurses' station, where staff members were busy checking on files and taking care of patients. "Are you always this busy?" Frank asked, glancing around. Doris nodded, leading him into a small patient room where an elderly woman was sitting up in bed, holding a cup of tea. "I try to keep up," Doris said, offering the patient a warm smile. "But when you love what you do, the work doesn't feel so much like work." She turned to Frank. "This is Mrs. Adebayo. She's one of our long-term patients. I've been looking after her for a while now." Doris carefully adjusted the pillow behind Mrs. Adebayo's back, asking how she was feeling and what she needed. There was a tenderness in Doris's touch, a softness that Frank had never seen in her before. It was as if this was where she truly came alive, in a space that wasn't glamorous or luxurious, but where her care mattered more than anything else. Frank stood back and observed as she went into a small room with a group of children coloring and chatting with a few volunteers. His heart swelled with admiration. Doris's world was filled with purpose and compassion, things he had never fully understood until now. Frank felt a knot tighten in his chest. As he looked around, he could not help questioning himself. He realized that his own life had been filled with shallow pursuits, wealth, fame, and luxury, things that in the end meant little in a world that needed more than that. He felt pulled to be a part of this world, but he knew he wasn't ready yet. They went home together afterwards, and Doris spent the night in his arms. A week passed after Frank's visit to the hospital, and the whirlwind of his life seemed to have slowed down for the first time in years. He spent less time at extravagant parties and high-end meetings, and more time thinking about Doris. Frank found himself walking through the quiet park on the edge of Lagos one evening, a place he frequented only when he needed space to think. He had invited Doris to meet him here, hoping to clear the air between them. The past few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, and Frank was torn. On one hand, he had a bet to win, and that was still very much on his mind. But on the other, there was Doris, the woman who had shown him a world he had never understood and had begun to change the way he saw life. His feelings for her were real now, but the truth of why he had come into her life still loomed over him. Doris arrived, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, her natural beauty shining through without any effort. She smiled warmly when she saw him. "Hey," she greeted, settling down beside him on the bench. "Hey," Frank replied, his voice soft. There was nervousness in him now that wasn't there before. "I've been thinking about everything." "I need to be honest with you, Doris," he began, his voice steady but laced with guilt. "I didn't come into us, for the reasons I should have." He paused, feeling the words heavy on his tongue. "I made a bet to see if I could win you over. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a game, but He looked at her, searching her eyes for a reaction. "I didn't expect to feel the way I do now." Doris's face went blank, and for a long moment there was complete silence between them. Frank's heart pounded as he waited for her to say something, anything, but she remained still. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but edged with anger and disappointment. "You've been pretending all this time, and here I was, thinking we were getting to know each other." Frank felt a sting in his chest as her words hit him like a slap. Doris shook her head softly. "I don't understand, Frank. You've been showing up in my life, pretending to care. Now I see it was all just a game, a bet." Frank's voice cracked with regret. "No, Doris, that's not it. At first I did it because of the bet, but everything changed. I didn't expect to care about you, but I do, more than I've ever cared about anyone." There was a long pause as Doris absorbed his words. The anger and hurt in her eyes were palpable, but so was the vulnerability. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Frank," she said quietly, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "I don't know if I can believe you now." Frank's heart sank. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I should have been honest from the start." Doris stood up slowly, her face a mixture of sadness and disbelief. Then she walked away. Frank spent the next few days in a daze, his mind replaying the moment of confession over and over again. The regret weighed heavily on him. He should not have made the stupid bet. The bet, which had started as a game, had turned into something far deeper than he ever anticipated. And now, Doris was gone. But Frank wasn't the type to give up. After a few days of reflection, Frank found himself at a small cafe by the beach in Lagos, the same one where he and Doris had first shared a quiet moment. It was the perfect place for a fresh start. He had asked Doris to meet him there, hoping for one last chance to explain himself, to show her that he had changed. Doris arrived, her expression guarded. For a moment there was silence between them. Frank took a deep breath. "Doris, I know I can't take back what I did. I lied to you, and I betrayed your trust. But I want you to know that I've spent every second since realizing how terrible what I did was." Doris's gaze softened, but her voice was still firm. "It's not just about the lie, Frank. It's about what it says about you. You saw me as something to win, something to conquer." Frank nodded. "You're right. I was so focused on proving something to myself that I lost sight of what really mattered. I never meant to hurt you, and I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart." Doris looked out at the ocean for a moment. "I don't know if I can just forget everything, Frank. Trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight." Frank understood. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's not that simple, but I'm asking for the chance to show you that I've changed." There was a long silence between them as Doris considered his words. Frank could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him. Finally, Doris looked up at him. "I don't know if I can just forgive you right away, but I do believe you've changed, Frank. I can see that you're not the same man who walked into my life." Frank felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a chance to rebuild what they had lost. Frank nodded. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me a chance." Doris smiled back. "One step at a time, Frank."